Welcome to the Remnant. Welcome back to the Remnant Christian book reading. We're going to go ahead and continue on with our book, Eli. We're in chapter 9 right now, which is pretty good. We're in chapter 9. We're going to go ahead and do it, but before we do, I do want to let you guys know that my voice and mouth area is not feeling too good right now, and I've been sneezing a lot lately, so if I sound kind of weird, it's probably because of that. But with that's not gonna stop me. But with that aside, we're in chapter 9. If you were not with us beforehand, if you didn't watch any of the videos beforehand, please go back. Don't even watch this one. Just go back to chapter 1. Start from there. Because if you start here at chapter 9, you're going to be completely lost. And you're going to get spoiled a whole bunch of cool stuff. So, go ahead. If you haven't already, start from the beginning. If you already caught up and you're here now, well, welcome. And let's go ahead and start. Chapter 9 of Eli. This is going to be good. Alrighty. Chapter 9. The celebration outside Lewiston Community Fellowship was in full swing. What was supposed to be an after-service potluck had turned into quite a party. And for good reason. Of the 40 or so members of the small, impoverished black congregation, over a half had been cured of some ailment. Everything from diabetes to athlete's foot, breast cancer to canker sores. Then there was the Emerson boy whose hand had been missing since birth. Well, had been missing. Not anymore. It had been several weeks since Conrad had seen such a concentration of miracles. Maybe it was because these people really believed. Or maybe it was because so few congregations were inviting Eli to speak that when he did, he found it difficult to contain his enthusiasm and his love. Whatever the reason, the morning had been quite an event, and this afternoon was proving to be quite a celebration. "Come on, brother." The pastor slapped his big, meaty hand on Conrad's shoulder. "You ain't hardly touched that food." He was a large man, always chuckling and grinning, with a gold tooth that often caught the sunlight. And he was sweating. Always sweating. Not that he could be blamed in this Texas heat. They'd been in the state 3 days now, and every day the temperature had easily hit the 90s. Conrad glanced down at his paper plate. Most everything was fried. Some of it he recognized, some of it he was afraid to ask. "And if you're hankering for something a little more substantial than lemonade," the pastor lowered his voice slightly, "there's a cooler back of Ronnie Hendrick's pickup that don't seem to be running out of beer." Conrad glanced up at the grinning face. "That's right," the big man chuckled as he dabbed the sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief. "Ronnie, he claims he only brought a couple six-packs, but dang if I already counted 2, maybe 3 dozen empties. And they say it's better than anything they ever tasted." Conrad stole a look at Eli, who sat on the blistered front step of the fellowship hall, chatting with several of the congregation. Somehow, he suspected healings weren't the only miracles he performed that day. "You call these clothes?" An old woman's voice rose from several lawn chairs over. "These ain't clothes. At least not for men." Conrad turned to see Leon enduring a lecture from some white-haired grandmother. "Makes you look like a peacock. What of them foo-foo boys?" Leon tried to shrug her off with a smile, but she was relentless. "You don't want people to be getting the wrong impression about you, do you, son?" No, ma'am, he mumbled.
What?
No, ma'am.
Then what you wearing girly things like this for?
Again he shrugged, and for the first time Conrad could remember, Leon Brewster didn't use his razor wit to fire off a snappy put-down. Not that he could still find space between her non-stop stream of words. Still, Conrad suspected that Leon's restraint had more to do with the day-to-day maturing taking place in him. Slowly, but very surely, he could see Leon growing less concerned about drawing attention to himself and more concerned about others. This was no exception. Instead of shutting down the old woman, he glanced sheepishly about until he connected with Will Patton, who smiled both in amusement and sympathy. Will Patton. There was another. Like Leon, he was also changing. In fact, he almost seemed comfortable around these 40 black people. Almost. Conrad was further impressed by Will's wisdom in trading in his muscle shirt for one whose sleeves were long enough to cover his racist tattoos. But it wasn't just Leon and Will who were changing, it was everyone in the group. Each seemed to be undergoing their own maturing process. Jake was getting a handle on his temper and oh Lord help me with this word. I cannot say that. Impetuousness? I think that's the word. Sorry, sometimes I can't say words. Forgive me. But let's continue on. Brent and Scott, along with their mother, were slowly grasping the cost of a real leadership. Even shy, retiring Trevor seemed to be coming out more and more of his shell. Then there was Suzanne. Dear, sweet Suzanne. What an incredible gift it was to have a second chance with her. But even she was being stretched. Just as Eli had said that Keith's and Conrad's greatest strengths was their weaknesses, so he had said that Suzanne's greatest strength, the intense love she had for family, was hers. On 2 separate occasions, she had approached Eli, asking if he would fly back to Lebanon, Tennessee, at her family's expense to heal her brother. And both times she had asked, he had declined. His response frustrated her, even made her angry. After all that she'd sacrificed for him, couldn't he at least do this for her? Even more frustrating was that when she pressed him on the issue, his only explanation was, "It is for God's glory." God's glory? Her little brother was sick and dying. For God's glory? The answer made no sense. And with each email from her sister describing his worsening condition, Suzanne's faith was being stretched to the limit. Finally, there was Conrad's own growth. From curious doubter to reluctant believer to, well, he wasn't sure what he was now, but for the first time in his life, that gnawing hunger, the haunting emptiness, was being filled. And it had nothing to do with becoming the best in his field or owning the most toys or betting the most beauties. The last thought caused him to wince. Was that all what all those affairs and marriages had been about? Trying to fill the void? The stretching and growing were more painful. There was no doubt about it. Particularly the continual battle to give up everything that made sense and to do it Eli's way. It was one thing to hear his profound teachings, but quite another to try and incorporate them in day-to-day living. And when Conrad wasn't frustrated at Eli's behavior, this current detour to Texas death row being the most recent example, he was discouraged at his own lack of growth. Eli? Suzanne emerged from the fellowship hall with the pastor's wife. a big hipped woman who sweat almost as much as her husband. Your mother's on the phone. She's down at the Imperial Motor Lodge. Eli turned from the porch steps and looked up at her. Is everything okay? Suzanne nodded. She and your brothers just want to say hi. Great. Have them come on up. I already tried that, the pastor's wife answered. Told her we have plenty of food and to bring the boys up and make herself at home. And? I think... Suzanne cleared her throat. I think she just wants some alone with the family. You know, just you and your brothers. Eli turned and motioned to the group sitting on the brown lawn before him. Tell her these here are my mother and brothers. Silence stole over the group. The abruptness of the reply made some of the folks uneasy. He turned back to Suzanne, fixing her a look. He spoke clearly and evenly, making sure she understood the depth of his statement. Tell her that the ones who hear what I have to say and do it, tell her they are closer to me than any mother or brother. Tell her they are my family. Conrad watched as Suzanne hesitated a moment. He knew full well what Eli meant, and he could see her weighing the implications in her own life. Finally, she asked, Is that really what you want me to tell her, Eli? Are you sure? Still holding her gaze, he nodded. Yes, Suzanne, I'm sure. All right, then. She turned hesitantly, then nodded to the pastor's wife. The two of them re-entered the building. They barely disappeared before the pastor called out, Say, Eli, I want you to meet a couple friends of mine. Eli turned to see him resting his big meaty hands on two gentlemen's shoulders. One, an older white man with distinguished gray hair. The other, a slender black man with a thin, wiry wrists. Both wore suits, and they looked as uncomfortable in the hot sun as they did out of place with the casually dressed group. The pastor nodded to the white gentleman first. This here is Reverend Caldwell from the First Assembly of Lewiston. He turned to the second. And this is Brother Hudson from God's Holy Sanctuary. Hi, fellows. Eli nodded. Both of them are on Lewiston Board of Clergy. They heard you were in town and they take, how shall I put it, a rather dim view on your visit to our fine community. There was no missing the mischief in the pastor's eyes. I see, Eli said. Well, please, gentlemen, make yourselves comfortable. I was just about to tell a story, one that you might find interesting. Thank you, Brother Hudson answered stiffly. Both men looked for a place to sit. The grass was certainly inappropriate for their dress, and the people lounging the lawn furniture and folding chairs felt no compulsion to volunteer their seats. Actually, Reverend Caldwell gave an awkward smile. It might be better if we just stand. Suit yourself, Eli said, but maybe off to the back so the folks behind you can see. Oh, certainly, Brother Hudson coughed self-consciously. Certainly. Now, where were we? Eli asked. The two slunk toward the back under the amused smiles of the group. You was gonna tell us about some company, a teen in a sleeveless t-shirt replied. But you hadn't decided what type, the heavyset mother added. An elder in a frayed sports coat spoke up. Make it an insurance company. How about a beautician school? Or a... Thanks, Eli grinned. I think I've got one. He took a brief moment to gather his thoughts. Conrad scanned the group. He estimated there were nearly 30 people there. 30 southern black folks sitting in the sun, Texas sun, waiting to hear some West Coast Jewish kid weave a story. He shook his head in amusement. The miracle just kept coming. Eli began. Once, there was a computer software company. That will work, the elder agreed. The owner was a genius. I mean, this guy created the absolute top of the line software. He invested wisely, hired the best managers, the best employees. Had great healthcare benefits? The mother asked. The group chuckled and Eli agreed. Had great healthcare benefits, plus a retirement plan, plus a daycare center, plus profit sharing. I mean, this guy had it all. Plus money, lots and lots of money. All right, Bill Gates. I'm talking bigger than Bill Gates. Someone whistled. Eli grinned. Once again, his ease and camaraderie with the group were obvious. But it was more than camaraderie. It was a joy and a love that he had for them, for each of them. And it was a love they sensed and readily returned. Excuse me. Eli continued. Eventually, he goes off for a long trip, spends the summer in Switzerland. Or how about Bermuda? A younger woman called out. Let the man speak, the elder insisted. Sorry. Anyway, when he logs on to check on how things are going, he realizes that the managers have locked him out. They've built a firewall he can't go around. So he calls up one of his corporate vice presidents and asks him to visit the plant to find out what's happening. But the guy, or gal, the younger woman corrected. Eli nodded. Or gal shows up, and the managers won't let her in. Not only will they not let her in, but they slap a restraining order on her, refusing to let her anywhere near the place. They can do that? Let the man speak. So the owner, he tries again with another corporate VP, only this time they beat him and throw him out with all kinds of threats on his life. So he finally comes back himself? The mother asked. Eli shook his head. No, not yet. Conrad watched as Eli grew more and more involved, almost as if he were taking the story personally. He sends yet another VP and he too is beaten and thrown out. So finally, he decides to send his own son, his heir who will one day inherit the company. I mean, surely they'll respect his own son, right? The group listened, unsure how to respond. They had also noticed Eli's growing intensity. But they don't. Not in the slightest. Instead, when the owner's son finally arrives and enters the building, they grab him. Then they beat him. Worse than that. He took a deep breath. Worse than that, they eventually decide to kill him. His eyes faltered, then dropped to the cracked sidewalk in front of him. Silence stole over the group. Finally, Brother Hudson, one of the visiting clergy, spoke up. Why is that? Eli turned to him, then quietly answered, You tell me. The visitor stiffened under his gaze. So they can have all the profits? The young woman suggested. Eli turned to her and nodded. Or maybe they can stay in power, another offered. What happens next? The elder asked. Eli looked at him a moment, then continued. Finally, the owner has had enough. He comes back home, with the sheriff and a truckload of deputies. He enters the building, and what do you think he does? Fires them all, the teen in the sleeve t-shirt shouted. And he tries And he tries the managers for murder, another said. That's his son we're talking about. Eli nodded. Yes, he fires everyone on payroll, and he presses charges against all the department heads for murder. And what happens to the company? The young woman asked. Ever so slightly, the sadness lifted from Eli's eyes. This is where it gets interesting. The owner then goes out into the streets and hires anyone who wants to work for him. Anyone? The teen asked. That's right, Eli smiled. Anyone at all. It doesn't matter how unqualified they are, how bad their work record has been. Not only does he make them his new employees with even greater benefits, but he also allows them to become co-owners of the company. The group approved. A few clapped. And the moral to all this? Rose Brother Hudson again. What exactly are you trying to say? A large man sitting with his wife and kids answered. The owner, he's supposed to be like God, right? Eli looked at him, his smile broadening. That's right. And the company, the teen added, that's like the whole world? No, fool, his buddy chided. It's like the religious establishment or something. Ain't that right, Eli? Right again. And those vice presidents? The young woman asked. It was the pastor's turn to answer. I believe those are the prophets of God, the ones who kept trying to turn the people back to him. Ooh, an older woman teased. Very good, pastor. He chuckled, flashing his gold tooth. Why, thank you, Sister Benson. And the managers? Reverend Caldwell's voice came from the back. It was brittle and cool. Eli turned to him, but did not answer. Caldwell cleared his throat and repeated a little louder. And the managers that were thrown out, who exactly do you intend them to be? Eli's smile slowly faded. It sounds to me like you already have your answer, he said. Why don't you enlighten us? Reverend Hudson replied. The answer lies in the scriptures you are so fond of quoting. Slowly, Eli rose to his feet. The group exchanged glances, unsure what was about to happen. Eli began to quote. The foundation which the builders rejected, the very cornerstone, is the chief cornerstone for the entire building. The two visitors remained unmoving, staring hard at Eli. He took a step closer, his voice growing more quiet, even more intense. And every person, regardless of their education, regardless of their wealth, regardless of their high religious position, to every person who falls upon this stone will be broken to pieces. The group remained silent. Only the clatter of dry leaves stirring in the afternoon breeze could be heard. Eli continued, speaking directly to the two men. And whoever this stone falls upon will be smashed and ground into dust. The silence grew as the entire group digested what had been said. But Conrad already understood. And he was already lowering his eyes, already shaking his head. Eli had done it again. Maybe I wouldn't have to go to other places if my needs were met here. How dare you! Daddy, don't leave. It was Julia between them in the living room. Maybe if I got the respect I deserve, I wouldn't have to. Respect? Don't you dare talk to me about respect. Please, Daddy. You with your bimbos, Rachel is twice the woman you'll ever be. She's... Get out! At least she knows how to treat a man. Get out! Mommy. She knows how to be a real woman. Get out! Her mother's voice was breaking. Get out! My pleasure. He spun around and headed for the door. She started after him. Daddy! But he was outside and slamming it before she arrived. The windows in the old house shuddered. Daddy! But Daddy was gone. Daddy was gone and only her mother remained, sobbing. Don't cry, Mommy. She raced to her mother and threw her arms around her legs, clinging tightly, burying her wet face into her skirt. Don't cry, Mommy, don't cry. Her mother's hand reached down, absent-mindedly, stroking the top of her head. Julie looked up at her through the tears. "He'll be back," she choked. He promised. He'll never leave me. He promised." But he did not come back. Never again. At least to them. Now, 20 years later, Julia leaned against the doorway of her old room, staring out into the living room, lost in the memory. It had been a long, excruciating day. Too long. She turned and headed into her bedroom, suspecting that tomorrow would be no different. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wasn't sure until last night. Trevor's waiting outside to take me to the bus station now." Conrad remained standing near the door. He watched as Suzanne fitted about the camper she'd been sharing with Maggie. The place always smelled of scented candles, a mixture of orange and cinnamon, he thought, and it always contained a certain warmth and homeliness. A peace, except this morning. This morning, Suzanne scurried about, busying herself with last-minute preparations to leave. He knew she was upset. He could tell by the way she kept her back to him, the way she wouldn't let their eyes meet. "Did you talk to Eli?" he asked. "Does he know?" He caught a moment's hesitation before she answered. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He said what he always says. Michael's sickness is for the glory of God." "I mean about your leaving. What did he say about your leaving?" Suzanne slowed to a stop, her back still to him. She took a trembling, uneven breath. Conrad immediately spotted it and crossed to her. He wrapped his arms around her. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay." She sniffed softly. "What did he say?" Conrad repeated more gently. She took another breath, steadying herself. "You know how he's always saying our life is made of choices?" Conrad nodded. "He said if I choose to follow him, if that's my decision, then I must hate my life. I must hate my mother and father. I must hate my sister. And I must hate my brother." "He said that? To you?" She looked down and nodded. Conrad grew cold with anger. This was too much. "Where is he?" "At the overpass. There's a homeless woman there that lives in the cemetery. People think she's possessed." Conrad knew the place. It was a quarter-mile away, easy walking distance from the campground where they spent the night. He released her and turned toward the door. "I'll talk to him. Don't leave until I..." She grabbed his arm. "Connie, no." He turned back to her. "Why?" "Because he's right." "What?" She still would not look at him. He continued, "Telling you that you're supposed to hate yourself, that you're supposed to hate your brother?" There was no holding back his indignation. He wanted to pace, but there was little room in the camper. "What about all this talk of love, all this..." "No." She finally looked up at him. "He's not saying I shouldn't love my family." "Then what is he..." "He's talking about comparison. He's saying my love for him should be so great that by comparison it's like I hate my family." "That's crazy. They're your family. Michael's your brother and Eli's just your... My what?" she asked. Conrad looked at her but said nothing. "He claims to be the Lord, Connie. The only way to his Father." Now it was Conrad's turn to avoid Suzanne's eyes. It was one of the incongruities he still struggled with. "And I believe he is." His eyes raised to hers. She nodded. "I do, but..." She took a ragged breath. "But he's not my Lord. Not if I put my family ahead of him. Not if I love them more." "What are you saying?" I love them more than him, Connie. I love my family more than the Lord, and if that's the case... She swallowed hard. If that's the case, I can no longer follow him. She turned, looking for something to busy herself. Conrad stared, dumbfounded. Then suddenly he declared, I'm going too. No. Her response surprised him. Why not? Listen, if you're not good enough for him, then I'm certainly not. She turned back to him. But you are, Connie. What? Following Eli has nothing to do with how good you are. It's about how much you love him. And you love him, Connie. Look where you are, how far you've come. You've even walked away from your work. Something I could never have dragged you from. I'm on a sabbatical. She shook her head. No. You love him more than your work, Connie. You love him more than your friends, your family. In truth, you love him more than... No. He shook his head. I do not love him more than you. She looked up into his eyes, holding his gaze. Yes, you do, she whispered softly. He shook his head, but before he could continue, she gently pressed her finger to his lips. And you should. He stood, searching her face. A moment passed before she suddenly reached over and scooped up a large black gym bag from the counter. He needs you, Connie, and you need him. More than you'll ever need me. She threw the bag over her shoulder and started for the door. Suzanne! He moved to block her, his voice growing hoarse. I lost you once. He struggled against the emotion. Please, I don't want to lose you again. She looked sadly at him. What is it Eli says? In order to find your life, you have to lose it. To keep something, we have to let it go. He searched her eyes. They were as shiny with tears as his, but he had no argument, and she knew it. Ever so gently, she raised up on her toes and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Then, without a word, she moved past him, opening the door, and stepping out into the morning sun. He remained standing, head spinning, putting his hand on the counter for support. That all you taking? Trevor called. Conrad turned and looked out to see her approach the boy's beat-up Toyota. It's all I need, she said. She opened the passenger door and tossed the gym bag into the back. Then, before ducking inside, she turned to Conrad and spoke one last time. Everybody has priorities. Everybody has to make a choice. This is mine. Suzanne... But he stopped, having no idea what he could say. She paused, giving a sad sort of smile. Finally, she turned, entered the car, and shut the door. Suzanne. He eased down the aluminum steps. Trevor dropped the Toyota into gear. The car lurched slightly, then pulled forward. The sun briefly glinted off her window, and when the glare disappeared, she was still looking at him. She gave a final wave, then brought her hand to her mouth and turned away. Conrad knew she was crying, though it was hard to see through the moisture in his own eyes. He continued watching as the car bounced along the gravel surface, raising a small cloud of dust, before it pulled onto the main road and disappeared. Not 2 minutes later, Conrad was storming toward the overpass, ready to give Eli a piece of his mind. Suzanne was the best there was, worth all of the others put together. And the best still wasn't good enough? Then who was? For the glory of God, he'd said. Yeah, right. More like his own egotistical pleasures. Hate others and love him. It was definitely time for a wake-up call. Hot humidity already saturated the Texas morning air, and as he walked, there was no missing the smell of sage and mesquite. He barely crested the rise to the overpass when he saw 2 police cars, 2 of them, and a third down on the highway below. He picked up his pace, breaking into a stiff jog. As he approached he moved closer to the steel railing for a better look. Down below was a red and white tow truck with the name Sorbet Towing painted across its door. The driver was busy hoisting up a white Dodge Caravan, its windshield shattered in two, maybe 3 places. The rest covered with spiderwebbing. Not far away, another tow truck had just pulled beside a burgundy Lexus. Its front end had been completely demolished, and its windshield was shattered as the Dodge's. Directly below, scattered across the pavement, were the bodies of several dead animals. A dozen, maybe more. Cats, from what he could tell. He glanced up and spotted Jake and Leon headed his way. "Hey!" he shouted. Then he slowed to catch his breath. "What happened?" Eli was about 30 yards behind them, talking to one of the officers. By his side stool, what must have been the homeless woman. The demonic. But instead of rolling around or writhing and screaming, she remained calm, listening as Eli spoke. "What happened?" Conrad repeated as the man arrived. "The cat lady back there." Jake jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "She had a bunch of those demon things inside her. Some of the locals wanted Eli to come over and help her." "It's the same old thing," Leon said, pretending to be bored. "The usual screaming and swearing, but finally their leader, or whatever it was inside of her, he begs Eli to throw them into a bunch of the woman's cats. She has like 100 or so." "And Eli does," Jake explained. "But the cats, they suddenly start leaping off the road like a bunch of lemmings, right down onto the highway, hitting some of the cars. None of the people were hurt, but there were definitely a few fender benders." Conrad glanced over the railing at the dead cats below them, then up at Eli, who had just shaken the officer's hand and was turning to leave with the woman. "Is she okay?" he asked. "Oh, sure," Jake said. "But here's the thing," Leon added. "Soon as the local police get word, they come up here and threaten to throw our rear ends in jail if we don't leave." "Why?" "Seems Eli has caused too much damage." "But," Conrad stammered, he just healed that woman. He just gave her back her life." "That's what I mean," Leon said, shaking his head. "One life completely healed in exchange for a couple accidents. Now you tell me what's more important." Jake shrugged. "Guess everyone's got their own priorities." The similarity of the phrase to Suzanne's caught Conrad off guard. "What did you say?" "I said they had a choice between Eli and some busted autos, so they voted for the autos. Go figure." Jake shook his head and the two moved past, heading toward the campsite, leaving a bewildered Conrad behind, trying to digest what he just heard. "Connie!" He glanced up as Eli and the woman approached. Though it was the end of June, she was dressed in the usual multi-layered clothing and heavy-worn coat of the homeless. Something about seeing the two of them together, their smiles and friendliness, increased his resentment, and the closer they approached, the greater that resentment grew. "Connie," he called again, grinning, "I want you to meet Elizabeth Warden." Conrad did not return the smile. His mind was still back with Suzanne, still back with her tear-filled departure, and Eli's words to her still rang in his ears. Before he knew it, his own words came before he could stop himself. He demanded, "How much more do you want from us?" The intensity in his voice even surprised himself. The joy in Eli's eyes faded. "How much more?" Conrad was practically seething. "To follow me?" Eli asked. "How much more do we have to give up?" "You already know that answer, Connie." "How much?" Eli paused a moment, searching Conrad's eyes, but Conrad would not back down. Finally, ever so gently, Eli gave his answer. It was very mild, yet absolutely firm. Everything. Oh, we look at that. We're at chapter 10 now, and that's what we're finishing off for the day. That was pretty good, huh? That was a good chapter. So, that was a really cool chapter. I have to say that right there we saw a lot about Eli and not a lot about Julia. I don't know. Write it down in the comments whether you like hearing more about Julia's side or Conrad's side. Because me personally, I like hearing about Conrad's side. I don't want to hear about Julia. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. But, yep, that's the end. Get ready. Stay tuned. Chapter 10 is coming soon to you. But yeah, if you like the book, if you like this chapter, then go ahead and like it. And, share it with people. Maybe there's someone you know that likes Christian books as well. Bring them to the channel. After this book, we're going to go ahead and go to another series of 4 books. Well, not 4 books. It's 3, 6, 9, 12 books. A series of 12 books. And then after that, we have another one that's another short series of 3. And then we can continue on. So we have a lot of books we can read, and they are amazing. This is just the warm-up. So be ready. Anyways, God bless you, everybody. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Or night. Wherever you are. God bless you. Bye.